all might know me already. My name is Julian Joseph, and yeah, today we're going to be talking about the Opinionated Salesforce DevOps Quiz. Another working title is the unofficial Salesforce DevOps Quiz, one that I generated along with some of my colleagues at Salto and some friends in the industry. So I'm guessing most of the people on this call have already taken it. If not, it's on my LinkedIn page. And happy to share that out as well if you're still interested in taking the quiz and you haven't taken it already. But today we're going to be going over the quiz itself. Not every single question, but a good number of them, as well as their answers. So if you take it, you might take it with all the answers already. So I am a Salesforce DevOps evangelist with Salto, and we are a Salesforce DevOps platform. We allow you to be able to see different dependencies and see your org in what I like to call a flat state. And of course, move that data around between different orgs. So if you're interested in our tool, if you're not familiar with Salto already, please go ahead and check it out. We've got a free trial where you can just sign up, hook up a couple orgs, start moving around metadata. Would love to get feedback from anybody who tries that out. And yeah, get any thoughts about what tools they're using for DevOps today, and if this one is one that works well into your flow. I like to think that we actually have a pretty nice and clean UI in particular. So if you're looking for something that's simple to use but still powerful, check us out. But like I said, I am a Salesforce DevOps evangelist with Salto, but I've worked at some other companies in the past. You can see them on there, GoFundMe, Salesforce, a couple others. If you're not familiar with me, I usually talk about my smart home products that I've got. I've got over 100 in my household. In fact, you might see one kind of behind my head through this green screen little camera that I've got right behind me. But much to my fiance's frustration at times, I'm always tinkering with them, improving them. Right now, it's not a smart home device, but I'm actually transferring data between his two iPads. Um, I'll tell him why later. He just said he's given up at this point. He'll just let me do what I'm going to do just to try to make things better around here. But yeah, I love smart home products in addition to Salesforce DevOps. And if you're curious about anything else I do, check out my site there, julian.social. That'll take you to my portfolio and some other cool links. So yeah, today we have a pretty straightforward webinar for you. So of course, we're talking about that quiz, the Opinionated Salesforce DevOps quiz. I'm going to give a little bit of context about the quiz itself, just the thought process behind it. Then we're going to go through a subset of the questions just to talk about why each answer is what it is and the thought process behind the question. We'll talk about a little bit of stats, so show some stats from the quiz. I'm guessing people are interested in some of the insights there. And then we'll have some time at the end just for any additional questions that come up about what you're seeing. In particular, I'll just say, actually, before I go into the context, I'll just say as we get into the questions, I'm very open to getting some feedback on their answers and the way they're formed. Probably be doing quizzes like this in the future, maybe some shorter versions of these quizzes. And so I love some feedback about the questions and whether or not you thought the answers were the correct answers, why or why not, the way the quiz played out, things like that. Always open for some feedback. But yeah, some context. The quiz itself, of course, has the word opinionated in it, and that is intentional because it is meant to be opinionated. It's meant to see not so much how good somebody is in general at Salesforce DevOps, although there's probably an aspect to that, but much more, do you think in the same way that I think? Because a good number of the answers are, and a good number of the questions are formed in a way that is like, what is the best, what is the worst, which is an opinion, I would say, in and of itself. And so I don't think I could say definitively that these answers are correct or incorrect in every situation or for every person, but this is the way I'm thinking about them. And so that's why I added in that word opinionated. Um, Also, the questions I tried to form them in a way that they were interview style. And so, what I mean by that is just questions that I think would be valid to ask in an interview to get some insight into the way that somebody thinks, and why they answer the way that they do. And so that was the intention. We also tried to make them at least at a intermediate level or higher. Intermediate for sure is just something that is somewhat subjective, but generally trying to take the questions beyond just like the basics of Salesforce DevOps and a little bit more difficult than that. I'd say some of them even go into some more advanced strategic thinking style questions as well. And then, just so you know, we reviewed these questions and answers with some other Salesforce DevOps experts in the space, some friends of mine, got them to basically double check. We actually made some corrections and some changes to the quiz as I was developing it. But just so you know, it was reviewed by people besides just myself. And then one other quick note, in case anybody noticed this early on, there was one question that within the 24 hours we had to correct the scoring of it. So that's number 16. You can see it down here. I actually talked about this question a little bit more in depth, but just an FYI there that if you took the quiz in the first 24 hours, especially if you got what you thought of was like nearly 100% and you got one wrong and you're just wondering what it was, if you took it near the beginning, it might have been this one. And that was just a mistake in the way things were scored on that end. After that first 24 hours of the quiz being posted, it was corrected, but just an FYI there. So next we'll be going into looking at individual questions and talking through them, the thought process, why they are the way they are. Again, feel free. We'll have some Q&A time at the end, but um, also feel free to just in context as we're like looking at these. I believe we have it open so that everybody can write into chat. So feel free to just ask questions in there, give thoughts there about these questions, and happy to answer anything along the way. So like I said, we're not going to look at every single question, but we're still going to go through order and talking about these individual questions. And so for the very first one, I just pulled out some of the questions just so I thought that would be the most interesting to chat about, and has some like bigger context. And so the first one was the first question. I'll go ahead and read it out. Your team has dozens of branches open, causing frequent merge conflicts and delayed releases. Which branching strategy best addresses this scenario? So something interesting to note for all of the answers that you're going to see, um, the top answer is always going to be the highest percentage answer. The way these were presented, by the way, were in a random order in the actual quiz itself. But the way we're looking at them right now, the top answer is going to be the highest percentage answer. And I believe for every single question, the highest percentage answer was also the correct answer. So just something interesting to note. Um, but yeah, in this case, that correct answer was trunk-based strategy. And so this right off the bat, this is a question that makes use of some of that subjective language, talking about what is best addressing the scenario. And so in this case, what I thought was best and what clearly, I guess 75% of people thought was best was trunk-based branching. Some of the other answers there, we have talked about long-lived branches, branches lasting multiple sprints, and abandon branches entirely, commit directly to production. Thankfully, nobody chose that last one. That was hopefully the most obvious one that was incorrect, although it can be very tempting. I've definitely done it myself at times. But yeah, the thought process behind this question is really going towards this idea of short-lived branches, not having long-lived branches is usually best. This tends to come up a lot when you are dealing with merge conflicts or needing to back merge often. If you have long-lived branches, you're much more likely to need to keep them up to date for a longer period of time, and therefore that can be prone to things like merge conflicts. And so that short versus long distinction there was like at the heart of this question. And so that's really what that answer was looking at. If you look at every other situation, it was talking about branches lasting longer, which generally is um, ill-advised. This is especially true if you are a believer in trunk-based development. Some people might have some other models that they prefer out there, but I would say it's becoming more and more common to say that this is the ideal whenever possible. Um, and I'm not going to go into like specifically what trunk-based development is today, or trunk-based branching, I should say, is today. That's a little bit of a bigger conversation, but essentially, I'd say the biggest difference is it's really prioritizing having as short as possible branches that merge up into this integrated branch as often as possible. I will note as well that this can be a bit tricky if you are not using scratchwork development, which I would say probably still the majority of teams are not fully using scratchworks, maybe partially, like a mix of scratchworks and sandboxes, or even still fully on sandboxes. It is fairly common to have a branch that mimics or is the same as um, that is the same as their orgs. Is that is so I have a branch that matches a one-to-one with their orgs. Um, I I'd say this is like a legacy issue that still happens within Salesforce. It's just the nature of having sandboxes in general and something that's like hard to get away from. But whenever possible, I see teams trying to like go towards trunk-based development. I see a comment saying would have liked a GitHub flow option. That's a great point. So I put Git flow on there, but then yeah, there's also GitHub flow, which has its own, I think, branching strategy. Honestly, I've looked at it before. I haven't looked at it too in depth, but that's a fair point that I think this probably would have even been a more advanced question if we looked at like some of the different kind of flows that go beyond just like trunk-based branching, but the full flow of like how code is going to go all the way up through a release. That's how I understand the difference there between like just talking about the branching versus like a full-on flow. Um, that's very fair. Maybe for a future quiz, I'll add in like specific GitHub flow and like we'll talk more about flows. So next question we're going to look at is going all the way up to number 6. So what's the primary distinction between a Salesforce DevOps engineer, a Salesforce release engineer? As you can see, this one was pretty universally answered, almost 100%. Everybody said the exact same answer, which also, again, was what we had marked as the correct answer. And so identifying a DevOps engineer is one that builds automation, pipelines, toolings, and a release engineer is one that oversees deployment executions, approval, release coordination. I usually personally think of a release engineer as tending to be more on the side of project management or really technical project management, but as being embedded with the team. Whereas the DevOps engineer is kind of more doing the typical engineer style task of actually, or I'd say like even coding something closer to a developer, but they're not coding necessarily the same things that a developer is coding. They're actually coding in or building an automation or adminning the tools that actually make things more efficient. I One of the main reasons I included this one is I can't tell you how many times I've been in an interview myself where it was pretty clear that the role that was being looked for was being put out there as a DevOps engineer, and they're actually looking for a release engineer, or vice versa, or they surprisingly wanted this person to be able to do both. Um, that's not, I would say that's not unreasonable to think that somebody could do both of these roles potentially. They could be a DevOps engineer and a release engineer. I tend to prefer separation there if at all possible. Obviously, that depends on team size and budget and things like that. But the way that these two roles tend to work, I see them getting conflated quite often, but I personally at least do see them as being distinct roles with distinct skill sets, with some overlap, but pretty separate. And so the only other answer on here, or the only other response on here that got any answers, was that second one, focusing on Apex code and tests, while release engineers monitor deployment errors and escalate to QA teams. I'd say one important thing, and I can see like some of the thought process of choosing this answer, but why I put it on here and why I didn't see it as the correct answer is because of this idea of DevOps engineer focusing on Apex code and tests. Usually, I actually think of that as more of a developer or maybe even an architect and or QA engineers, so other members on the team rather than a DevOps engineer. And again, with the release engineer monitoring deployment errors and escalating things to the QA team. At least, especially on the deployment error side, I actually think of that as being the role of a DevOps engineer to a degree. I think a release engineer could be impacted, and really everybody on the team might need to be aware of deployment errors to a certain degree. But in terms of like correcting them and like being their primary focus, that actually falls on the DevOps engineer. And so, yeah, just seeing comments again. Thanks for comments. Can you describe where you see Salesforce dev skills playing to each of these two roles, i.e., Apex skills being useful when solving merge conflicts? Yeah, great question. And that just reminds me of another common situation of interviewing for DevOps roles and realizing, oh, actually, you're looking for a Salesforce developer, which you'd think you wouldn't get those two confused, but it happen. I've seen it happen all the time. That being said, is there like value of having Salesforce development skills? And so when I think of developer skills, like you said, Apex skill set, being able to resolve merge conflicts in the code itself. Um, yeah, are they useful with these skills? For sure, they can be. Like as a DevOps engineer, I don't call myself a developer. Can I do some Apex to get down and dirty when I need to? And is it useful? For sure. Often, the biggest use, in my opinion, is more to delegation and to knowing who this falls under. I mean, if it's something to do with Apex specifically, usually you're talking to development team, because more often than not, you are not the one that whose code caused the merge conflict. It's maybe you are noticing it in the pipeline, or you're kind of building tooling around it, and you see that merge conflict, but then you need to go work with some other person on the team who actually wrote that code. Having some skill sets in terms of like knowing what that code is supposed to look like and knowing if it's maybe Apex versus some XML versus maybe XML that's like just some fields and some typical metadata versus something more complex like a flow. I think knowing knowing and being able to identify definitely useful. Um, Additionally, I would say it's fairly common to create tooling that involves some level of Apex. Um, there's definitely a lot of like GUI tools out there like Salto, um, and some other tools that have their own UIs, and a DevOps engineer might be adminning, but they could also potentially just do some things maybe hard coded using Apex. I've definitely built Apex scripts that just generate data in orgs, or move things around, activate, deactivate different things. So really just I would say small bash style scripts is what I would call them. Definitely useful as a DevOps engineer just to make your life easier and to not rely solely on the features of another tool. So certainly valuable, but not a requirement. For release engineer, at least in the way I'm thinking of release engineer, I don't think it's as, I mean, any kind of Apex skills, any kind of coding skills is going to be useful to a certain degree, but usually I see even a release engineer being another step removed because they're even doing more of like the people delegation, the figuring out timelines and things like that, relying on the team to focus on the technical part and being abstracted away a bit. That's my thought there. Just another tip at the very bottom left, I'm saying this is in regards to just when you're applying to roles, given my experience, apply to both. If you see release engineer and DevOps engineer roles and you're like, that's the field that you're going into, you want to advance in, since they tend to get confused quite often, I'd say apply to both. Even check out developer roles to see how much of a DevOps skill set is expected. Sometimes they write it there in the role description. Actually, they're looking for a DevOps engineer. They think they're looking for a developer. I've seen that happen as well. Or they don't know that they don't know that they can find a DevOps engineer. And so you're kind of using that opportunity to apply and like show them that you exist. Next question we're going to look at number 8, which is your CI pipeline currently runs all automated tests on every commit, leading to slow builds and delays in feedback. Which of the following is not a good way to improve performance while maintaining confidence in test results? So this question is either the first or second in terms of the most diverse set of answers, which to me is like, I mean, the first thought is like, did I write this question well? Because people are choosing other things. Still, the most common answer was the correct answer, but definitely one to like, I'd say, you dig into a little bit more. And so, again, just looking at the question itself, we are looking at running, like currently all automated tests are being run on every single commit, but things are working slowly. And so, or things are too slow for our comfort, whatever that is. Maybe things are taking hours. And my first thought here is it's probably a situation where developer makes a commit, then they want to merge that code up because they're pretty much ready to go. They got to wait for the automated tests to run, but it's taking so long that they're having to step away from the computer, go do something else. Or maybe they're just running those tests to verify that they haven't failed any tests, that none of them are failing. Maybe they suspect they might be failing a test or two and they want to know so they can get verification and correct it. But again, it's taking so long that they don't get that feedback soon enough for them to make a quick change. So then the question here is like, what what are some things that we can do to slow or to reduce that amount of time with having as little impact on the quality? And so some of the different options here: turn off all automated tests during regular development. And sorry, I should focus on this is not a good way, which is another, maybe this almost like a little bit of what felt like a double negative in this question is like we were looking for which of these is basically the worst way. And I probably should have just said worst just to be extra clear there. Because all these could be different levels of good and bad, but we were looking for which one is the worst. And so the correct answer was turn off all automated tests during regular development and only run them at release time. So this is basically saying when developers are developing on their feature branches or they're integrating, we're not going to run tests there anymore. We're only going to run them at release. Um, Effectively, this is the opposite of shift left thinking. This would be like shift everything way to the very end. Um, I'm trying to think if like there was a situation where that would make sense that I would agree with. Like it would have to be a very extreme situation to say, oh, that's what we got to do, because basically you're not getting any of that validation till the very end. If you find a bug on release, then you have to go all the way back to the earliest part of development to get that, and then push it all the way through the process to get it back to the end. That's again the opposite of shift left. Some of the other potentials that were not the worst, but still had various levels of, I would say, success is work with the QAs to categorize tests based on their risk, and with others, um, instead of triggering them on every commit, maybe look at moving some of those tests to other parts. So I'd say actually the first and second ones are essentially the same strategy, just one is the um, extreme version of it of like let's push everything till the end. The second one is more like strategically, hey, maybe some of these tests we can run that are like quicker to run and more valuable. We can run them on every single commit, and other ones we can run them at further left down the life cycle. But we're not going to say we're going to just turn everything off and push it all the way to the end. Another way to look at this is, yeah, splitting up tests and running them in parallel. Definitely a fairly common strategy and a good thing to look at. With each of these solutions, there is some level of risk in them. And so when you split up tests and run them in parallel, first of all, if you're splitting them up to any degree, they're not running end to end, they're just not as realistic to a customer scenario. So there might be things that you would only find if you run the full test and not each half of the test. So that's one risk when splitting them up. And then also when you run things in parallel, especially if you're running them all in the same Salesforce environment, there's a chance that they could conflict with each other depending on how those tests are built. Hopefully they shouldn't conflict, but definitely it's not uncommon that they do. And so they could create false negatives or even false positives as well. So there's some risk there. And then for the last one, work with the QA development team to identify tests that are no longer needed and can be optimized for performance. Again, I feel like that's another version of like the first two. It's just like really working with the team to look at the tests themselves and see if there's anything that just can be turned off and is like, yeah, not needed. With all of these, I'd say like the key to thinking about all these potential answers is like keeping confidence high. And like whenever you are going to change the way your tests run, you're probably introducing some level of risk, and you want to do it in the way that keeps the confidence the highest. Another key part that I was looking at in developing these potential answers was like working with a team versus just like making a choice and doing something. And so I really like the idea of like bringing in the right people. A lot of times on the DevOps side, we think about what tooling that we're using and what changes do we need to make, and what automations we're building, which can all be valuable, but a lot of the value actually can come from just talking with people on the team and who are experts in whatever they're doing. QA is probably experts in the test. Engineers are probably experts in the code, and working with them to make sure whatever changes we make are going to work well with them, and just also take in their knowledge, just to see if there's any, I would say, kind of shortcuts to the answer. In this case, maybe QA knows about some tests that are just basically useless and are slowing things down because they're on like old features that are not we don't use anymore, and we just never thought to turn them off. You could like devise a whole solution around like splitting up the tests and running them in parallel and doing all this work, or you could just go and ask them and find out, oh, we don't need to do any of that because these tests are not providing any value anyway. So just using that team knowledge, I'm big on. Next question, number 11. Your development to an org, oh, sorry, your deployment to an org fails due to Apex test code exceeding CPU or socket limits during validation. What should you do to ensure the deployment succeeds? And as you can see, the correct answer here was coordinate with developers to review and fix failing test classes. And so this is another one. I mean, we're talking about in the last question about working with the team and the knowledge that is there. And this is another good example of working with the team. I'll also say this question was largely about ownership, which we also kind of talked about earlier about like Apex code and how much Apex code you need to know as a DevOps engineer and how does that play in. In general, when something is failing in Apex, unless I wrote it as the DevOps engineer, which might happen in some rare scenarios, typically that's going to fall on some of the developers on the team. And this is really just to like identify who owns that part of the process. Usually this is not the DevOps engineer, this is going to be developers. If it has to do with Apex, especially if it has to do with things like timeouts, that tends to be pretty clearly in a developer's bucket. Now, another key part of this is this idea of like coordinating with developers. I mean, just because it's not under the DevOps engineer's like ownership per se, it doesn't mean it's not impacting the deployments, for example, or other parts of the process. And so the DevOps engineer can still be working to help coordinate and to make sure that some of these things are happening to make sure the deployment works as expected. But typically, they're not going to be the ones that are going to go in and make the change to the Apex code unless they're kind of like doing a dual role of developer and DevOps. And some of the other answers you can see remove affected test classes from deployment to avoid execution. It's kind of like in the last question of just get rid of the test, which this I would say this is kind of implying you're just going to just do it on your own just to kind of get past this error. While I could see that being useful in a really short term, like you just want to double check if that's the issue. It's usually not going to be a good long term because those tests might need to be run for a valid reason. That's really, to me, that's only like emergency situation that I'd ever consider just removing tests to get deployment out. Um, yeah. And then retry deployment using a full deployment instead of validation only mode. In this situation, uh, just retrying as a full deployment, if anything, you're more likely to hit these limits. So that doesn't really get you past this issue. Um, if you're hitting limits in validation, you're probably going to hit them even more so, if anything, in the actual full deployment. So just the FYI there. Um, yep, that's about it for this question. So next one, number 13. And just so you know, total, I think we're looking at 8 questions. So we're a little more than halfway through, I want to say. So number 13, which of the following steps is least likely to help you identify and reduce pipeline timeouts during metadata deployment to production. So another one, just to keep in mind here, is like the word least is in here, so that could be part of what trips people up. I remember, I think it's not showing in these responses, but in the quiz itself, there was some like ability to do some design of the text, and I'm pretty sure I tried to make some of the words like bold and like to make them really clear that this is what we're looking at. So I'm pretty sure I made the word least bold here. Um, but just an FYI that we're like looking at what is the least likely to help. And so in this case, the answer was disable all validation rules in production before deployment up there at the top. And so why is this the least likely? Well, the main reason is validation rules in general should not impact deployment timeouts or impact deployments anyway. I wouldn't say it's like absolutely impossible, but that's definitely not anywhere near the first option I would try. If I was trying this, I'd be like at the point where I'm like, I'll just try anything. Because really validation rules, unless I'm getting a really specific error saying that somehow related to the validation rule, which I've never seen, um, yeah, disabling them or editing them in any way, I wouldn't expect to really impact deployment in general because deployment has to do with metadata. Validation rules generally they have to do with data. And so typically they're not going to interact or interfere with each other. This was another one, though, I will say, that had a pretty diverse set of answers, as you can see. And so going through each one of them, each one of the other things that could potentially impact and reduce timeouts. So use the check only equals true flag to simulate deployment without committing changes. And so this can help you just get this information quicker if you're doing a validation only deployment. It's actually something we allow you to do, by the way, in Salto is like choose which type of deployment. But also if you're using the CLI and other tools typically allow you to say, hey, is this going to be a full deployment or is it just a validation only deployment? That could help you get information quicker about whether or not there's like some timeout or some other issue. So just a good idea to do. It also is lower risk because if you are testing things out and trying to fix the deployment, you might not want to actually deploy whatever you're trying to fix. You might want to just like validate, did you fix this timeout or did you fix some other issue? And so always a good thing to keep in your back pocket. Break the deployment down into smaller groups of related metadata and deploy incrementally using automation. So that's something I've definitely done before. If you're hitting something like a timeout or a record limit on a deployment, for example, one that comes to mind is I think custom metadata records, at least at the time. This is a few companies ago, but I remember we were hitting a limit. I want to say it was like 10,000 plus custom metadata records, which we just had to split into multiple deployments because there is that hard limit. And so if you're hitting a timeout, if you're hitting a limit, that can be something that's certainly valid to do. And then review deployment status and logs, identify large or slow component, analyze text execution times. And so this goes back into if you're doing like a full deployment, it definitely can be looking at what is getting deployed specifically, if that's hitting some limit or hitting some failure. That's definitely valid, and that's part of. Like, I would say the last two kind of go hand in hand. Sometimes I'm actually splitting out those larger components or maybe more complex components where I suspect there's like actually an issue. I'm leaving those out of like the big deployment and putting them in a separate one to help isolate it and identify the issue or potentially prevent hitting a limit on either end. So yeah, definitely all valid. Again, feel free to, if you got any questions or thoughts, feel free to write into chat as we're going along. I think we just got a couple more. So number 14 here, your CI/CD process is in place, but deployments frequently fail due to incomplete or invalid metadata. What should you do to catch problems sooner? This is been a theme. If you can see, I pulled out a lot of the deployment ones just because I actually think a lot of a DevOps engineer's day-to-day job is dealing with deployments. And maybe I should even like clarify what is a deployment. At least in my mind, it's basically moving things from either your repo or your local computer or between two orgs, just moving things around. They're being like deployed from one place to another. If you're thinking about chain sets, if you're used to those, that's kind of a kind of deployment, or deployment is part of that process. And so, yeah, I think of a lot of what a DevOps engineer is doing, especially in the Salesforce space, is making sure that that data is being moved around from those places well and efficiently. And if there are errors along the way, which there can be quite often, that they're getting corrected or improved upon. But anyway, in this case, deployments fail frequently due to incomplete or invalid metadata, which you do to catch them sooner. The answer is kind of in the previous ones, but yeah, use that validation only deployment. It's like a good first step right there to verify that um, if you're doing a full deployment, like you just do a validation only and see if that shows that issue. And it could speed things up. It could also reduce risk, like I said, in that you're deploying something that you don't want to as you're doing testing, as you're doing verification. Some of the other answers that people chose, though, implement scratch org expiration timers to encourage regular rebuilds. I will say, in reading some of these answers back, I feel like I can at least see the thought process, and that's part of the reason I'm thinking I probably should have used the word best just to make it even a little bit clearer that it's not that there's not value to some of these other answers. I just think there's like clearly a best place to start. And the other ones are creative and maybe ways to get to this same solution, but um, usually not the best place to start. And so, for example, implementing scratch org expiration timers to encourage regular rebuilds. I can kind of see how this could help improve incomplete or invalid metadata because it's a similar principle to, I'd say, like the trunk-based branching, or just this idea of like having short-lived branches. Same idea with scratch orgs, having these environments that are short-lived. In theory, you need part of what that means is you need to get the data, whatever changes you're making it, let's say as a developer, out of that org and into another org or into your version control as quickly as possible. And if you're doing this frequently, that means that org is going to be short-lived. In fact, by default, scratch orgs have a max of 30 days that they can be around anyway. So they're going to expire. So you need to get those changes out. And I'd say that practice just encourages having better metadata because you're probably are going to be pulling things out more quickly, more often, probably merging them more often. And yeah, going to have, yeah, just could lead to better, healthier metadata. I would say in an indirect sense, but it still could happen. Um, Implementing expiration timers. I've never gone as far as really encouraging expiring scratch orgs quicker, excuse me, with a team by like forcing maybe some level of expiration. I mean, first of all, even implementing the timers could be tricky because really people can just build scratch orgs on their own typically with their permission. So it's hard to force that. Although there are some ways you could do it. But regardless, I feel like 30 days is plenty to keep people moving with their changes anyway. So I don't my gut is to say this wouldn't actually help as much as you think it would help in most situations. Another one is use commit message conventions and PR templates to improve traceability. Again, I could see how this could indirectly improve invalid metadata. I mean, just having better practices in general, and so being better with yeah how you're what you're writing your commits and PR templates and things like that may trickle down to like how to what kinds of metadata changes that you're making and dependencies, making sure you're bringing in the right dependencies, things like that. I can see that indirectly supporting and really not a bad idea, but not as direct as like using a validation only deployment first right out of the gate. And deploy only during off hours to avoid overlap sandbox refreshes. I can kind of see that one as well as being another real pretty indirect approach to this. It's a pretty disruptive change, first of all, to make the team only deploy during off hours, I would say, if they're used to deploying like all throughout the day. And it has other knock-on effects that I'd say could be concerning, but could it potentially prevent like some kind of invalid metadata errors from time to time just because maybe you're bringing in all those deployments to happen all at once versus like individual deployments. I could see that as being possible, but it's also going to have some other negative effects that I wouldn't recommend. Last couple of questions. Number 15, you've made updates to a Salesforce flow that will change frequently as part of its evolved feature. What's the best way to confirm it works correctly after each change moving forward? And so the crux, I'd say, of this question is really looking at the word frequently here. This is another one where the rest, I mean, could have some, these are all potential ways to um, basically do another set of validation on this Salesforce flow, a way to check and test it out that makes sense to a degree. But when you say the word frequently, to me, that means you don't want to be doing manual changes or you don't want to be doing manual tests if something is going to be changing all the time. It's possible, but it's going to slow you down. It's going to be really expensive. You don't want to be just running reports and doing and verifying like changes that way. First of all, how you run those reports, I don't know. It kind of depends on what the reports look like. Um, but generally speaking, if you're doing something that's changing very quickly, I usually the first thing the word I think of is how am I going to automate this? How are we going to verify it? Sometimes some of these other solutions they work in the short term, especially on the manual side. I mean, sometimes you just need to make a validation before you automate it. That's pretty typical. But really getting to the point where and focusing on, okay, let's automate this as soon as possible, as soon as it's reasonably possible. I feel like that is like a clear skill set I would look for if I was, for example, interviewing somebody to do a DevOps role that they're thinking, oh, can I automate this? At least questioning it and trying to think through it as a desire whenever they hear that something's going to be changing very often. And then number 16, this was the same, by the way, this is the one that had the correct in that first 24 hours of people taking the quiz. And later on, it was corrected. So if you got this wrong early on, when we did the final results, by the way, I did like the final kind of scoring and leaderboard. I did add in people's correction even in those first 24 hours. So that was all accounted for, but just FYI, in case you're wondering why you might have gotten this one wrong, but you didn't actually get it wrong, that maybe it's because you took it in those first 24 hours. But yeah, this question, fairly straightforward. Which of these Salesforce settings cannot be deployed using metadata? This question I would call the most experienced based question because it's like one of the quirkiest parts of Salesforce is knowing what can and can't be deployed. And so in this case, I say it's an experience based question because you might not know this unless you've actually tried it out or you've learned it or you've like it's like almost like you either do or you don't know it. There isn't like any clear rhyme or reason for the most part as to why some of these things are deployable and others aren't. It's just that that's the way these are some of the things that Salesforce has basically developed an API for, developed a way to do at scale, and other things they haven't. Um, Not that Salesforce doesn't have any rhyme or reason around it. I'm sure there are some reasons, but it's not always immediately clear to us, and sometimes it's just something you have to live with. And so in this case, yeah, enabling or disabling my domain, at least to my knowledge, there is no way to do this programmatically um, with deployment. Maybe another way, if I was being like really pedantic, um, in a sense, I wouldn't call this a deployment, but there are ways to pretty much automate just about anything in Salesforce. And that's if you can't do it through a deployment, you can often at least do it through some UI automation. Now, when I say UI automation, I think if you're familiar with either RPA or automated UI tests, or if you've seen Salesforce or excuse me, ChatGPT operator, OpenAI's operator, some of those Anthropic's, basically clicking around on a web page and doing things. Simulated parsing is always pretty much a way around it, and I've done that for a lot of things that you can't deploy the change, but you can automate them. Yeah, I see somebody saying that they use Playwright as well, and so that's like Playwright is a framework for automating web browsers, which probably a lot of these other tools are built on top of, like ChatGPT Operator and some of the other ones. They're kind of like probably using Playwright or something very similar to click around in the browser. And so there's always a way to automate if you get creative enough, but some of them are just really expensive or frustrating to work with. And so my domain is one of them. I've actually never personally automated my domain. I've tried to think of all the steps it would take. It's also like an async change, like you have to wait for it, and it kind of just takes a certain amount of time in the background for it to complete. But generally speaking, all these things are doable to a degree or not to a degree, but they're not necessarily deployable with using metadata. So I was like really specific to say using metadata in this question. Maybe one other somewhat rule of thumb just to think about and then to question if something is automatable in case you're like in the situation. And I've noticed like for myself, I've gotten used to Salesforce over the years. You can start you kind of start to just guess, oh, this is probably not deployable through metadata API. And I'm always surprised from time to time. Sometimes it is. I think it shouldn't be, or and vice versa. But more often than not, if something is a multi-step UI in Salesforce setup, if you go into setup and it's kind of like these multi-steps and it's especially if it's a nice pretty UI to some degree, to me that tends to not be automatable. Especially if it's a little bit older as well. They're doing better and some of the newer things are more automatable. They're like all based on metadata. Not everything, but a lot more things tend to be. And some older things just have never really turned into deploy ha some of them they've never like added in deployable metadata steps. So it's something I feel like you kind of get a sixth sense for it over time, but it's just like an experience and a quirk that you get used to. So yeah, that's it for the questions. Just before we wrap things up, just wanted to show a couple of stats for the quiz at large. And so as you can see, the average was 76%. And just so you know, I actually looked at both the median and mean average, and they were both about like 75, 76%. So nearly the exact same there, in case you're wondering about those two different kinds of average. And so, yeah, it was a passing grade overall, which is cool to see, but also it wasn't a super high average, which was by design, I would say, knowing that this is one opinionated and that we're going for like intermediate to advanced, and by no means did we like restrict people from taking the quiz who were at various levels. And so, if anything, this is actually a little bit higher than I would say in my mind I was aiming for, because I did want to make this quiz challenging enough to where you were also kind of learning and doing at the same time. But this was interesting to see. I'd still say it was within the ballpark with what I was expecting. Also, just the total number of participants, 87. Just so you know how many people, getting pretty close to 100 people took this quiz. There's 7 perfect scores. So again, that was like another metric I was thinking about as I was creating the questions, like how many people are going to get perfect scores. I was kind of actually aiming for maybe 1, 2, or 0. And so that would made me think maybe this quiz is a little bit um, easier than I intended off the bat, but also would love to get feedback. Maybe this is like just enough. It would have been frustrating to take anything more difficult, or maybe this was too easy. I'd love to get that feedback or just right. Please let me know. And then one other interesting metric, I roughly tried to look at environment and deployment style questions. So like Scratch.org, Sandbox, all those deployment questions, which are a lot of ones we looked at, versus more strategic questions and tooling questions, and just see how people did with each of those categories of questions. And so with the environment and deployment, that was lower than the strategy and tooling, which was interesting to me. I don't want to say that it says too much about the people taking the test or the test itself. It's kind of hard to know on either end. Maybe these questions were just easier or more difficult in the nature of the way that I wrote them. Um, Definitely, if I were to recreate this quiz again, I would like look more at like evening this out or just like verifying that these questions are pretty even as much as possible, just to get a better sense of what this might say about people's skills on each of these ends. But this is just something interesting to know. If I were to guess, I would have thought it would have been opposite, that the strategic questions would be a little bit lower, and then the environment and deployment a bit higher, just because I feel like even outside DevOps engineers, just general developers deal with deployments to a certain degree. But yeah, it's interesting to see how this it was a bit backwards from what I was expecting. Yeah, and then I see would love to get any questions right now. I already see one kind of question comment on here. On a personal note, can I see which question I got incorrect? If only to debate over a beer sometime down the track. Yeah, would love that. Would love to talk to anybody individually about their questions and debate individually would be kind of fun, or you can do it right now in chat. Obviously, yeah, but that's a good question. Can you see your individual? And that was uh, a really good point. I can definitely see them, and I could send them to y'all, and I'll need to figure out like a systematic way to do that if you're interested. But at the very least, let me know, perhaps on LinkedIn, or feel free to email me. I'm gonna put my email right here in the chat. If you want to see your individual answers. Yeah, that was one thing that, and I'm going to go back. We use Typeform to run this quiz. It's one of my first times working with Typeform, but I'm kind of curious. Obviously, we didn't want to say the answers right away because just to discourage any level of cheating, because we had a leadership board and we just want to keep it as fair as possible. Um, but I think it's also valid to want to know. I would want to know what answers I got correct or incorrect as well, and debate over them and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, definitely let me know. And I'm going to also look into see if there's a way. I wonder if there's a way in Typeform to just kind of like mass email that out um, to people so everybody can see their scores after the fact now and see their specific question answers, I should say. But yeah, with that, any other questions, feel free to type them in chat right now. And also would love any general thoughts about, um, again, if the quiz was too easy, too difficult, too opinionated, like it felt like you had to guess too much what I was thinking rather than the actual, I guess, skill-based questions. Would y'all like more of these quizzes in the future? I'm thinking at the very least doing like, I want to say mini quizzes, maybe 5 to 7 questions versus this was a 20 question quiz. But maybe some shorter ones that focus on like maybe CI/CD tooling specifically, um, or goes in on deployments specifically, kind of more advanced. Yeah, open to it. Also, feel free to email me those thoughts as well. I'm not seeing any questions come in, which is totally fine. I know we were answering and talking through them as we went along. Yeah, thank you so much for participating. And yeah, as I said earlier, I'm a DevOps evangelist with Salto. What we are is a DevOps platform. We have a pretty sleek UI, especially for doing deployments. Definitely an improvement on a lot of things like doing change sets deployments, in my opinion. So give us a try. We've got a free trial. I'm also here to like chat through. I just love talking about people's situations and seeing what challenges they're having. And so yeah, feel free to give us a try. And yeah, we'll be doing more of these webinars in the future. Feel free to, if you're not already connected with me on LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn. We'll love to keep chatting there as well. And we'll be posting about future webinars and any other quizzes or things like that that we do. But yeah, with that, thanks so much for joining and looking forward to chatting with y'all later.